All right, good deal. Well, it's a pleasure to be back with you folks. And if you were on for the last one or watched the video, there's going to be a lot of similarities. But I hope what I like to do with these is if you guys have any questions specific, because as you probably could guess, I'm not exactly a yak breeder and not as familiar with what's going on here as you guys are from the breed standpoint or the species standpoint, but I think in general, genetics pretty much are similar across the beef cattle as well, and that I'm fairly familiar with that. So if anybody has any questions, don't hesitate to jump in and let's get them answered when we go, and then we'll open up for questions at the end as well. All right. So I guess the first question, I think, before we could ever talk about a breeding program or what we want to do from a genetic standpoint, is we have to decide what it is that we're trying to produce. And I understand that meat is one aspect, and certainly there's going to probably be some meat, whether that's your primary product that you're producing or even if it's a byproduct. Fiber as well. Had some nice little discussion about fiber here as we were getting on. Uh, at least, and I don't know that the industry is mature enough quite yet to be getting to this point, but I would assume that over time, at least like in the beef industry, there became sort of a separation between the seed stock side of things and then the commercial or production side of things. And I could see that at some point in time certainly being the case with yaks as well. There's no shame in the hobby aspects of it. I think particularly on the beef side of things, we kind of get sometimes might criticize or make fun of maybe the hobby side of things, but I really think there's absolutely a place for it. It does, as long as we have conscientious folks that are in it more for the fun of it, it can still be good for the overall industry as well. And then might be various other things. I know work and different other aspects that people get into the yaks as well. So what is it that's driving your motivation? That's a little bit of a different question. What is it that you actually want to do with your herd? Is it dominating at the show ring? Is it basically you're looking to expand the industry in general, and because it is such a small population, I guess currently in the U.S., that is a reasonable thing or motivation within your program is really number expansion and having more of them. And also, another aspects of yaks, I think, is to provide a healthier red meat option. I've had the opportunity to taste some, and I was quite impressed. I'll tell you the truth. And then personal gratification. That certainly might be a motivation for some as well. Just enjoy it. It's fun. You enjoy how they look. You enjoy having them out in your pastures. Personal gratification might be a motivation as well. And I saved this one for last, and that's the financial aspects of it, because on the beef side of things, Jeff and I are always focused on the financial side of things. Everything that we deal with our beef producers, we're trying to push to that end goal of economic success. And I would encourage you guys to at least approach it from that standpoint. And I'm not saying that, and it doesn't have to necessarily be your number one thing that you're after, but Jeff and I were discussing it the other day. Even if it is a hobby for you, it's always a more fun hobby if you make a little money or at least don't lose a whole lot of money. If it's a hobby and you're losing tons of money, I doubt if you're going to be a long-term participant. It just, no matter how much you enjoy it, if it's draining the bank account, then it's probably not going to be a long-term thing. So breeding objectives were kind of the main target that Jeff wanted me to talk about. And so that's where we're going to kind of hit, is how do we develop breeding objectives, and then how do we meet those breeding objectives? So a breeding objective is just a goal that influences or is influenced by genetics in your herd. So you set those goals of what it is that you want to do, and if there's a genetic component to it, then those need to be a breeding objective that you have. The things to remember about a breeding objective is that sure if I can figure out this pointer thing or not. Let's see if that does it. There we go. So some of the things that we think about, as I mentioned, economics, I think is going to be a reasonable thing to consider when we're thinking about the breeding objective, whether that's our number one goal or not. It needs to be an aspect of it. The two things that play a role on the economics are the production side of things, and when you think about the production side of things, remember there's the what we're producing, but also what are the inputs that we're having to put in there, because things like feed conversion and all, those are genetic factors as well. So if we can produce a lot with less feed, then certainly that's going to be an economic advantage as well. And then how we're going to market our product, whether that's the meat you're producing, whether that's the fiber, whatever. And once again, if you're in it for the more of the aesthetic side of it, coat color certainly, and the horns and all those aspects may play into that marketing as well. And so that kind of fits in also as well as this eye appeal and personal preference. If that's the pleasure that you get out of it, then that can certainly be a part of how you try and develop your breeding objectives. And then social issues as well. If there's aspects of it that you know that give you social benefit, then certainly that could be a part of your goals too. So just to give you a couple of examples, and these are now focusing in a little bit more on specifically how you would do it. And I would encourage you all to, I challenge you actually to when you start thinking about breeding objectives and what it is you want to do with your herd and how you want to change it from a genetic standpoint, is to write those objectives down. I think that if you just have a breeding objectives in your mind and plan to do them, that it unfortunately you don't always follow through on it. I think if you'll write it down, it keeps you a lot more accountable. So one of those breeding objectives, just to give you an example, might be to maintain calving ease. Certainly we don't want to get in a situation where we're having to pull a lot of the calves that we're producing. I think temperament is certainly an issue that we always have to be aware of. So minimizing the uncontrollable animals might be another breeding objective that we want to focus on. Optimizing production efficiency. And we do that through high pregnancy rates or trying to minimize the sickness and death that we have in our herd. If we can do that, then certainly that's going to help us out from a production standpoint in terms of being as efficient as we can. And then let's say one of your main objectives is producing meat for restaurants or even freezer beef or freezer meat for local customers, whatever it is you're trying to produce, then that might be a breeding objective too. So that's the breeding objectives for say one operation, and it may or may not fit. You can certainly adjust these however you want to fit yours. But just to show you a second example of how they might change. Now this operation, I think most everybody would probably have that they want to have good calving ease. I don't, like I said, I don't think anybody enjoys having to pull calves at any time. And I think also as well that most of you would probably have that as a breeding objective. But here we start to change. Now with this operation, there might be less focus on the economic side of it. So we still want to think about economics, like I said. And so here, this breeding objective is more to minimize or moderate at least the economic losses that we might have. And of course, preferably you would want that to be profitable, but that might not be your overall driving objective. And for this one, this producer, their other breeding objective is to produce the best looking royal yaks that are going to do well in the show ring. And so a little different slant, not one's not better than the other. It's not a pick your choice, but certainly I think each of you on this talk tonight may have what I would think would come up with a little different list of what your breeding objectives may be. So once we have those breeding objectives, what can we do about it? What tools do we have to help us to meet those objectives? And for you guys on the beef side of thing, we talk a lot about crossbreeding, but you guys really aren't set up more in the breed type, as clear cut as what we are on the beef side, but you can still do outcrossing, and that's just breeding less related animals to each other. And then of course on the selection side, and that's where the main part of tonight's talk is going to be on the selection side of things. We will go over the outcrossing, but I think at least my understanding from communicating with some of you guys, I think the outcrossing, most people at least understand the concept, and I know that's a part of a lot of your breeding objectives. And so this is just breeding lines that are less related to each other. And so ultimately what we're doing is simply trying to minimize the inbreeding that we have. And the reason this is so important and really needs to be a primary objective of you guys is that the impact that it has on reproduction and just the overall longevity of the females that you're keeping back in the herd. The biggest advantage of outcrossing is the impact that we get to those traits, and certainly in the beef industry, and I would think in the yaks as well, reproduction is the most economically important trait that we deal with by several fold. And so it is certainly something that we need to try and do as much as we can with, because I'm going to show you in a little bit that reproduction and longevity are actually, unfortunately, lowly heritable traits. So it's hard for us to make much improvements on our selection side of things and its practices. We really have to take care of it more through this outcross side of things. And the other benefit is that it does reduce undesirable homozygous recessives as well. These can be what we call lethal recessives, where if we get the homozygous lethal alleles that pair up, then we get abortions, or the embryo is never developed. And so it certainly causes reproductive losses. And we can also see genetic defects and things like that in even the live born calves as well. So it definitely helps us to reduce those. It might not eliminate them, but it will help us reduce the incidences of those occurring. So the tools that we have to work with, genomics, and I do applaud you guys for an industry that's not been around, at least in the U.S., for a long period of time, but you guys have really taken advantage, I think, of some of the genomics technologies that we have, and I applaud you for that. I know that you guys are working on the AI side of things, trying to make that more viable. If you can ever get that done, then it's going to help greatly, because where AI helps especially, and if you can get frozen semen and transport frozen semen, is that you're not just having to depend on the animals that are in your region, where things can really get inbred pretty quickly, and certainly on your own farm. But when you can start importing genetics from the other side of the country, it's a lot easier to find lines that have a lot of separation from what you currently have. Some of the software that's been developed to look at the genomics and help you to match up those animals certainly helps as well. And then the last one I have is I know that Jeff and I discussed that there's some attempts to try and bring in some of the European genetics, and that's going to always be a benefit. Now, once again, there's going to be some level of relationship still coming in, but I would say that that's probably going to make a big boost to the ability to outcross, is bringing in some genetics that have been separated for an extended period of time. And so those are all good, viable means of improving the outcrossing in yaks. So the big focus that we're going to talk about, though, is the selection side of things. And this is just deciding which animals are going to produce the next generation, and hopefully with the objective of trying to make some improvements in the genetics that are influencing those particular traits. So some of the traits, and I know this is not an all-inclusive list, but it's at least, I think, some of the bigger things that you guys deal with in the yak side of things. The structure of the animal certainly is always going to be important in most any species that we deal with. Structure is for a couple of things. We have to have our animals able to get around the pastures, consume forages, and then in the breeding season, they either have to be mounted or have the ability to mount. And so all of those things are structural issues that that we need to be on top of. The other part of structure is that it's a heritable trait. And so if we maintain animals that have poor structure, then we're just keeping it around in the herd, because they're going to then produce animals that are likely to have poor structure as well. Calving ease, I really am not certain what kind of how important or what incidence of calving difficulty you guys have, and so the amount of pressure that needs to be put on calving ease would depend on how much problems you currently have. If you're having to pull a lot, or if you're losing females because of calving difficulty, then you would certainly want to emphasize that trait at a greater level than if you're currently don't have any issues with it. If we're trying to produce more pounds of animal to sell, whether that's meat or in whatever aspect, then weight gain is certainly a trait to consider. Milk, whether that's from the product of milk, or if we're talking about our females having additional milk to raise larger calves. Either way, that's a trait that is often going to be considered. The fiber traits, whether that's quality or quantity. Reproductive rate, like I say, from a selection standpoint, it's probably we're going to have a difficult time influencing that, and particularly at least at the level of the information that you guys have available to make selections on, that we're going to talk about here in a little bit. Once you can have enough data and enough information in the system that we can get genetic evaluations, then you can do a better job with maybe trying to improve reproduction with selection. But just based on phenotypic records, I can tell you right now it's going to be hard to make much progress on those traits through our selection practices. The meat traits, improving the quality of the meat, whatever those traits might be, something that would be of consideration. Disease resistance, I think that this is a trait that we're probably going to have to rely on genomics, and I think we're getting more and more information all the time on the cattle side of things, and I suspect that a lot of that information that we're going to find out on cattle is going to benefit you guys as well. That's how that tends to work with species that are close together like that, and so I think there's some opportunities for selection for that in the future. Of course, the color patterns, that's going to, and the horns, we can do some things with those as well. So when we think about trait categories, there's really two that you need to kind of think about, because it's different selection practices that we use for each. The first is what we call qualitative traits, and these are traits that are usually visual in nature and usually controlled by just one pair of genes, and there's usually very limited impact from the environment. Coat color is a classic example of a qualitative trait. The other are our quantitative traits, and these are usually controlled by a large number of genes, and there's usually a big influence from the environment on these traits. These are typically traits like our weight traits, structure, any of those kind of traits fall into the quantitative category. And it's it's a little bit tougher to get at the quantitative traits because of that, the unknown factor that comes into it, because environment, like, sorry, I have a gaming headset, and if I don't have anything coming from you guys after 15 minutes, it shuts off on its own. Sorry about that. So the quantitative traits, once again, controlled by many genes, and the big unknown, like I say, is the environmental aspect that can play a role there and throw us for a loop sometimes. So, but we'll talk about how to handle some of those things. So selecting for qualitative traits, these traits are for the most part simply inherited traits. And so we can tell a lot for the most part just by looking at the animals. If you, we have two different types of simple inheritance, and you guys deal with both of them. The first is what we call additive. And with that one, we can completely tell when it's an additive trait just by looking at the phenotype. We can know what the genotype is. And the other one is dominant. And I'm going to go over examples of both these here on the next slide. But with this one, you're going to need to have a genetics test, a genomic test, to be able to determine if one is a carrier or not. And so, as an example, for the coat color one, like I say, that's an additive trait. And so that's the case that when we have a solid animal, that's when it's both, it's homozygous for the solid allele. And if we have when we get the royal, that's when we have the homozygous for the royal allele. And then when you cross or you get the heterozygote, in that case, what you see is the trim coat color. And so with those are patterns, with those patterns, that's what you're going to get, when you have an additive genetic effect. When you have a dominant, though, that's the case in like nose color, where the imperial, the imperial allele is dominant. And so when we get either the homozygous situation or the heterozygous situation, they're going to show up with the imperial nose color. And then they're native if they have only when it's homozygous for the native allele. And so with that one, in order, if you have this individual, since it's going to have the imperial coat color, the only way you're going to know which of these two it is to have the genomics test to tell you if if it's a carrier of the native allele or not. So when we think about quantitative traits, now records become extremely important. This is, and I know that Jeff has hammered on you guys pretty hard about the importance of records, and I'm going to back him up 100%. It's impossible to make genetic change for quantitative traits without some records to go by. Now, of course, there are some traits that we don't have really good records on, and we can make some progress for visuals for a trait like structure or something like that. We can't really measure structure, and that is a quantitative trait that we can make changes to. But for the most part, records are going to be extremely important. Another aspect of the quantitative traits is that we need to think about, in order to compare them correctly, you're likely going to have to adjust those measurements that you take, particularly for things like a weight trait. And now this is the typical for cattle. We typically deal with for the weaning weight, what we call the 205-day adjusted weight. But you could do the same things in yaks, whether that would be 205 days, I don't know, whatever the typical 200 or the typical weaning age is, you could fit that in, and it still would be basically the same formula, just changing the days that you're adjusting to. Now, we do always recommend that when you're going to adjust to a particular age, that you try and keep all the calves that you're going to adjust together within a fairly close, within say a month on either side of that, to keep it relatively close in terms of trying to make those adjustments and do the comparisons. And the other thing that would have to, that's going to take some records on your part to be able to come up with are what we call these other adjustment factors. And that's how much benefit at weaning do you get by being a male versus a female for a trait like weaning weight, because we know that males for the most part are going to be heavier, and that shouldn't be a discount to the dam that raised a daughter. That shouldn't be a discount to her, and so we usually would sex adjust that calf up if it's a female, to make it comparable to the females that had bull calves. Same thing with age of dam, and again, that's probably even going to take more data to try and get a real good understanding. So for cattle, we know that the first calf they have as a 2-year-old female, they're going to raise probably the smallest calf they ever raise, not because of genetics, just because they don't give as much milk at that young age. And so and ours incrementally increases up to 5 years of age. And then we figure when they're 5, they are probably at maximum milk production. And so this the same adjustment over to 10 years of age. And once they hit 10, it starts going back down again, because of their age, they start milking less again. And so where those ages would be and what those adjustments needs to be for yaks, that's going to take a good bit of data, and then putting it through some statistical models to come up with what those adjustments should be. But it's easily done. It just requires the data from you guys' part to be able to get to the point of being able to do it. The trait also must be heritable, and we'll talk about the heritability here after a little bit. And then currently, I think the best method that you have for making your selections is based on phenotypes, or those actual measurements. Hopefully, in most cases, they're going to be adjusted measurements, and then the ratios, and we'll discuss ratios. I'll give you the definition and what we're talking about with ratios as well, and some of the issues with that. So with ratios, you remember when we do ratios, for the most part, if it's going to be an adjusted measurement that we want a ratio on, then you're going to want to take the measurements, take the weights or whatever, do the adjustments to start with. And this is an example for a weaning weight one. So we would take each individual in the herd or in that contemporary group, and we would take its individual adjusted weight and divide by the adjusted weight of all the animals in that contemporary group. Okay, so the individual's weight divided by the average adjusted weight of all the individuals in that group, and then multiply by 100. And so that's going to give us our ratio. So as you can imagine, if it's a ratio of 100, that means that animal was average, because its weight was equal to the average weight of that contemporary group. So when you multiply it by 100, we come up with a ratio of 100. So if we have an animal that turns out to be a 115, that means it's 15% heavier than the group of animals that it was raised with for that trait. Okay, so basically anything above 100 means it was above average of that contemporary group. Now, a lot of people put too much emphasis on that, and because it's not been that long ago that we were dealing with ratios a lot in the beef industry. Prior to getting genetic evaluations, this was the primary selection tool for us, up until about probably the mid 80s. And you would often hear people say things like, well, I would never buy a bull that ratioed under 100, because I don't buy below average cattle. Okay, and that's a fair enough remark, but that's somebody that was really putting too much emphasis and not fully understanding ratios. And I've put together a little example that I think should kind of explain that. Hang on, I got it in just a second. We'll go through what the issues are first. So the first is that when we do ratios, we can't compare animals across contemporary groups. Even if you have on the same farm, let's say you have a fairly wide calving season in the spring, and let's say that you decide, because that have a pretty wide spread of ages of those calves, you divide them into two contemporary groups, the younger group and the older group. Well, when you do the ratios, 115 in the say the older group is not necessarily equivalent to a 115 in the younger group. You can't even compare within the same herd across contemporary groups, and certainly wouldn't be able to do it with animals from a different herd. We can't compare animals of different ages. In other words, the bull you produced last year that you kept as the herd bull was ratioed as a 125, but this year you had a bull that ratioed 135. So you're thinking, well, I've got to replace my 125 with him. It doesn't mean that he was better necessarily than the bull that was a 125 the year before, because if you think about things like that, you have to consider that the group he was raised within has changed as well. And here's one I get this argument too, and there's some truth to it, but it's kind of easy to manipulate ratios and phenotypes in general. It's a bit easier to cheat than it is with, say, genomics or even genetic evaluations. But I'm going to assume everybody is going to be honest and fair. So here's my example of trying to explain why you have to be kind of careful. So let's say that forbid you have to have heart surgery. And so if you're going to have open heart surgery and you're kind of deciding where it is that you want to go, or what doctor that it is that you want to perform this heart surgery. And the first option you have is the surgeon that had a class ratio of 110, and he graduated out of the Acme Heart School. Okay. Is that the guy you want to pick, or would you maybe decide to go with a surgeon that only had a ratio of 90 but graduated from Harvard Medical School? So it would be the same situation with cattle. If you had a bull that was from, say, one of the top genetic herds in the country that might be below average, and from a ratio standpoint, he could be a genetically superior bull than a bull that was from say, one of the less desirable genetic herds in the country, because half the bulls in that least desirable herd in the country are still going to ratio over 100. And so half of his bulls are going to be over 100, even though they may all be bad. And so you have to just kind of be careful. You have to some degree, evaluate the overall production of that operation, and then look at ratios within that production system. So, as I said, for quantitative traits, we certainly that we have to have the records, must be heritable. Some of the other ways to select is selection based on SNP information. And I know that there's some discussion about that. The problem with that is to do a very good job with that, there needs to be a lot of phenotypic records that go along with that SNP data, and so that we can get some true associations that a particular SNP is very favorable, say, to calving ease versus another one. Without a lot of data, just looking at those at the SNPs, it's not going to tell us a thing until we have a lot of data that tells us what that true association is. Then it's not going to be a lot of benefit. The other thing we have to be careful of, and this was a mistake that we made on the beef side of things, that at the time I was highly opposed to, but I was in a pretty good minority. When we first came up with genomics in cattle, or started having it applied in cattle, they had it was a star system, and it was for quality grade and marbling in cattle. And so they found a particular SNP that impacted marbling. Okay. And it had a reasonable effect. I think it had like a 5%, accounted for 5% of the variation, which is fairly large for a SNP. but if you think about only accounting for 5%, that's not controlling a whole lot of the variation within that herd. And so they were encouraging people. I mean, people were paying big money for a 2-star marbling bull, and then they came up with a second snip, and so all of a sudden you could buy a 4-star marbling bull. And I can tell you that the value against a no-star bull, it's impossible to know, because we could tell a lot about 2 snips, and that controlled less than 10% of the variation for that particular trait. And so we're talking about a trait that probably, I would guess, closer to 50 traits that have significant influence on a trait like or snips that would have a impact on a trait like marbling, and we were only accounting for 2 of them. That's not telling us much about really the DNA information of that. We've gone way past that now, so that we're looking at 50,000 SNPs and looking at that full association for all those on a particular trait. So ultimately, in the end, and this is what I hit on a little bit more the last go around, is that I think that the long-term goal of you guys ought to be trying to get to the point where you're computing breeding values or getting EPDs. I think you're a ways away. It's just going to take keeping on plugging away at keeping uniform records, and that's the importance of it too. I would encourage you guys to get on board on things like when you're wanting to adjust, say, weaning weights and things like that, what records need to be collected so that you can get to the point of being able to have genetic evaluations computed. So I want to go through and just kind of show you the process of how we're trying to make genetic change and some of the things that are going to impact that. And that's the magic equation. This is our genetic change equation, and the factors that are going to influence how fast you can make genetic change. And so the first component there, that I, that's what we call intensity of selection. And we'll go through and I'll show you what each of those are. The other part is heritability, that we've already been talking about a bit. And the third component is the generation interval. And so we'll talk about those 3 things and what you can do about each of those different components of the equation. As you can imagine, for the quantitative traits that we deal with, those are in almost all cases going to be normally distributed, or at least somewhere close to normally distributed. And so that just means that the majority of the animals are here in the middle, very close to average. We have a subset out here that might be on the extreme side of things. So if we were looking at the distribution in cattle for frame size, so that's out here on this end are going to be those extremely large framed cattle. When we start looking out on this end of that bell-shaped curve, we're looking at the extremely small frame cattle. And then in the middle, the majority of the animals are going to fall in that pretty close to average across the board.
Darrh, did you want to
Yep.
say that was you in that picture?
See that good-looking fella with the green and orange striped pants and the cowboy hat? That's me. I was 10 years old in that picture. I won grand champion at our Tri-County show fair and sale. So a proud moment. I can tell you that was the first calf I ever showed, won grand champion. To say the least, it went downhill from there. You'd have thought I'd have got smarter, Jeff, but at the time I was a senior, I got a white ribbon. Okay, so first let's hit on that intensity of selection. What is intensity of selection? So it basically means where on that bell-shaped curve do you draw the line, and you're going to select above that. Okay, so at what point do you draw the line? If we're thinking about this from a ratio standpoint, so here we drew the line at about a ratio of around 128. It looks like because we were wanting to keep back 15%, say of our females. Now, if we were wanting to increase, so intensity has to do with the distance between the average and where you draw the line of where you're going to make your selections. And so it's a shorter distance if we selected 15% of those females to keep them back, as opposed to if we select only 10% of them to keep back. Now we've got a larger number for intensity of selection. And so it's more intense. And so since intensity is in the numerator, then the bigger the number, the faster the change. And so the fewer that you keep back, typically, or of the high end of things, then because your intensity is greater, then you're going to it's going to improve or speed up how fast you can make.
Hey, Darren, and on that intensity, you're talking about taking the top 10%. It's not that you're just, if I have 30 animals, I keep 10%, that's 3. You're saying again that that index is what is key down
Right.
there.
Yes, you're keeping the top 10% or the top indexing animals. And so where here we kept everything that was a 127 or above, here we kept everything that was probably a 135 or above. Okay. So intensity of selection, when we have some ways that we can improve that for you guys. One is going to breed bulls and cows with superior values. Now, that's either within your own herd, just picking the top indexing bull, to keep back as a herd bull within your herd, or if you're going to buy bulls from other genetic sources, once again, buying the top end bulls from those genetic sources. And also particularly for the heifers that you're going to be keeping back those that have the higher values. And if you have cows that are underperforming, culling them is certainly going to help you in that regard as well. And because what you're still looking at the overall average of the whole herd ultimately to see how fast that change is going to happen. So for retention, once again, that was really what I was showing you before with that previous slide. We're going to keep the superior heifers. And then the other thing is bringing in bulls from outside that are superior. Anytime that you can go somewhere else and bring back in. Now you don't always have to do that, and particularly if you're maybe on the upper end. Jeff, am I not coming through?
Yeah, I got you.
Okay. Well, your thing was lit up, and I got scared because my headphones had beeped, and I was afraid I was out of power. So okay.
No, I was going to ask you to make.
Okay.
There's a general comment, a rule of thumb out there that a bull, the bull's contribution to genetics over 5 generations is a pretty big percentage, and the
Oh,
bulls
good
can change,
gracious.
right?
Yes. Yes. So the one that I've always heard is like the last 3 bulls that you used counts for about close to 90% of the genetics in your herd. If you're keeping back replacement females out of those bulls, because of the rate that you're turning over and the influence of that most recent bull, of course, is going to impact 50% of the calf crop, right? And then the last 2 bulls that you used previous to him, and possibly even some from him, are going to have replacement daughters in the herd as well. So yeah, the last several bulls that you used are a big chunk of the genetics in your herd. So heritability. Now, I'm going to tell you right now, this is the one that you really can't do a thing about because you can't alter heritability. That's nature talking, but it can tell you maybe which traits to focus on a little bit. Because like I said, for selection, it's hard to make much progress because it is lowly heritable, and so our progress is going to be slow. Once again, it's in the numerator, and so smaller values means that our progress is going to be slow. Things like health, weight gain, moderately heritable, and so from a speed standpoint, it's rapidness of change going to be moderate. the end products and things like fiber, frame size, all those traits are highly heritable. Those are the traits that we can really change the most rapid. So the last big one is generation interval, and this is the one that can get a little tricky on us. So it's basically just the amount of time required to replace the next generation in your herd. And really, it's going to be impacted by your culling rate and your selection intensity. And I'm going to show you that relationship here in a little bit. And the best way to kind of measure what it is the approximate age, average age of the breeding females and males. Now we do these separately. So there's going to be a pretty big difference, but since the females are contributing half your genetics, then you do a generation interval from them. And then also the bulls that you're using, you would do a separate generation interval for them. And so then the averages of those two is what we're going to be looking at. Okay, and so here's two different situations for you. So let's say that your cow herd is comprised, I mean, and this would be extreme, at least on the beef side of things. Somebody kept back 30% of their replacement heifers. If you think about it, to keep back 30%, you're having to keep some that are pretty average kind of heifers. And so your intensity is relatively low. Your selection intensity that you've implemented is going to be relatively low. And that's going to also lead but it's going to also reduce your generation interval though, because you're keeping back more young females. Okay. And so since generation interval is in the denominator, lower numbers increases the speed of change. And so from a downside, we had to use a lower intensity, but it gave us lower generation intervals as well, which offset maybe some of that lower intensity for selection that we had. Whereas if we did a more typical situation where we kept back 10% of the heifers, now our intensity of selection is much higher because we've got a good spread between the average and the actual animals, the average of the animals that we kept back. But now we only have 10% young females and 90% cows in the herd. So that's going to negatively impact our generation interval. It's going to give us a higher generation interval, which is going to hurt us from a genetic improvement standpoint. And so just to go through a couple of examples of how that might look, if we look at a trait like, let's say, weaning weight, once again, and let's say that we had an intensity of selection. So the females that we selected, or the group that we're breeding, is 20 pounds heavier at weaning than the average of the entire group. That trait is approximately 40% heritable. And let's say that we have a generation interval of 8 years of age. The average age of the animals, the females in the herd are about 8 years of age. Then we could expect a 1 pound improvement per year for the weaning weight. And that's not exactly fantastic, right? I mean, yeah, we're improving, but it's going to take us a while to see much improvement to weaning weight. If we half that generation interval, if we started doing, if we kept the same level intensity, now that's going to be harder to do, but let's say we bought in more bull power to keep this the same, but at the same time lowered our generation interval, did a little bit faster turnover of the animals that we're keeping, we doubled that rate of change that we made within that herd. And I'm going to tell you right now, if you're not paying much attention, if you're not keeping records, if you're not doing anything to be able to try and change that intensity level, it doesn't matter what number you put down here in the denominator, you're not going to make any change. If you're not actively selecting the better animals for each of the traits within your herd, then you're going to make no genetic change for those traits. So let's be clear about that. Don't worry about that number if you're not going to keep the records and make some selection decisions on the better animals in your herd to improve that intensity. So the other thing that I also want to point out is we don't always, not every trait has to have an increase. If we get to the point that we need to be in saying this is what that we're to that stage on the beef side of things, it might take you guys a while to get there, but we're to the point now for things like carcass weight, things like mature weight of our cows and all. We're needing to put the brakes on and even maybe start moving in the other direction a little bit for some of those traits. And so selection works that way just as fast and just as easily as it does on the positive side. So it always keep that in mind. You can use genetic and selection decisions to keep things as they are if you're pleased with where you are for traits as well. So need to, when we make our selection decisions, need to consider those marketing options, what it is where, so if you're heavy into the fiber side of things, of course, that's where you're going to focus the traits that you want to be focusing on primarily, and then having meat as a byproduct. Considering your management and environment, once again, that's a really big deal on the cattle side of things. Folks that try and put too much growth and too much milk in their cows and don't manage them correctly get us into some real reproduction issues. And I would assume that would be the same on the yak side of things as well. You need to focus on the economically relevant traits. And the way I try and encourage our beef guys is think about every trait and say, does that trait either have the potential to put money in my pocket or take money out of my pocket? And if your answer to that is yes, then it needs to be a trait that you consider. That's what we call an economically relevant trait. And then the tools that you have available, depending on where you are, at this stage, you have to maybe consider uh, particular tools, and as the industry advances, maybe you'll get better tools in the future to work with. I'm really not going to talk about this at all, but except from the standpoint, I just want to tell you, regardless of, we always encourage you to, look at multiple traits at the same time, the different ones that impact you. But I can tell you, the more traits that you focus on, the slower your progress is going to be for any individual traits within that group. Okay. So don't just throw in every trait under the sun and try and think you're going to make vast improvements across the whole spectrum. That's not going to be it. So select the traits that are most important to you and focus on them, because really and truly, the fewer traits you have in that group that you're making these selection decisions on, the faster you're going to be able to reach those goals. But always keep an eye on those other traits and make sure you're at least not losing ground on them. So my thoughts on genetic improvement of yaks, I think that the record keeping is an absolute must. And as I mentioned before, if you guys can all get on the same page, you're going to be much better off in the long run. Utilize outcrossing, particularly for traits like reproduction. I think you're going to see a vast improvement there. And my understanding, that's a very big concern within the yak, is that there are some reproductive issues. So the better we can do with outcrossing, the better you're going to be. And then with selection, phenotypes, whether that's the appearance or the weights, recorded measurements, use ratios when they can benefit you. And something that Jeff and I discussed the other day that you guys might consider, particularly where you have some relatively concentrated herds of yaks, is to consider maybe a bull test where you have a central place where you can bring in bulls and compare them for things like rate of gain. Even you can even look at some things like feed efficiency and things like that. So might be something to consider if you decide to go that route. I wouldn't reinvent the wheel. There's a lot of data out there, like from when we were going through those, the bull testing era and the beef industry in the 60s and 70s and up into the 80s some. There's a lot of information we can get you on how to run a good bull test if some of you want to give that a try. Jeff, with that, I'm going to turn it over to see if there's any questions.
Thanks, Dr. Bullock. Everybody,
Hey, if I stole anybody's pictures, because borrowed, let me say that. If I borrowed anyone's pictures from the internet, please be flattered and don't sue me, because I, 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 I picked a few from here and there. Jeff
Thanks.
sent me one though. He can't sue me.
I did. Thanks, Dr. Bullock, and everybody. You feel free to turn on your videos and unmute and ask any questions that you might have. To get us started there, I'm gonna throw one out, and Bob Stuplik, get ready for this, because this is going to be kind of in your and Greg's kind of area, and then it could be any. Greg, you kind of mentioned it, I think, on the purple side. So Darrh, let's say we were wanting to introduce a specific fiber / coat color for specific fiber like white, because with white, there may be some whites fibers that are eased dyeable versus others that don't accept dye very well. And let's say that Cat found a white bull that had a very nice white fiber that would accept dye. And I wanted to perpetuate that in my herd. I probably then would put less selection intensity down, maybe for other traits, is what you're saying, because I want to get that specific fiber trait in a greater population, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, and I'll tell you a classic example of that, Jeff, is what we did when certified Angus beef took off to the point that it did, and all those other breeds like Simmental, Limousine, Gelby, those breeds wanted to turn theirs black. Then they went through that process. They went through a grading up process, first of all, to get the black allele into their populations. They already had some in there, but then they started emphasizing that black allele. And so I'm going to tell you right now, you would go to bull sales and you would see a very sorry black Simmental bull top the sale for that very reason. And now, did it hurt the breed in terms of the quality of the animals they were producing initially? Absolutely. It really did. But now you can't hardly find a red bull. And from a marketing standpoint, I guess ultimately, I thought it was crazy at the time because I thought the black thing was a fad. I was wrong. And so absolutely that's what you have to make some sacrifices. And so you don't want to sell the farm, I don't think. And here's a good example. I think that still a very bad structured white bull should be avoided in that case, because that's something that could be extremely detrimental in the future. If you find out that the white cattle is carrying, say, some lethal recessives that you're concerned about because there's a relatively high, accumulation of those lethals in the population, then you can't just sell the farm. In other words, use some reason, but yes, you're going to give up on some traits.
Other questions anybody has? Don't let him off too easy. Here's one. Let's see. Yes, I will certainly send out a copy of the slides. Dr. Bullock sent those to me today, and so I'll send those
I
out.
updated them a little bit, Jeff, so don't let me send you an updated version first.
Okay, I'll do that.
I
Go ahead,
think,
Greg.
yeah, an observation, and maybe it's just me, but my sense is that most of our herds are not being operated for genetic changes. That, we may sell because, say, if I have a small herd and I have one bull, I'm probably going to sell all my females because I can't do anything with them because I only have the one bull. I mean, I can't keep and breed them. So for that reason, I'm kind of cut out of genetic changes. And I think a lot of us don't organize our herds that way. We sort of have our animals that we like, and maybe there's one that looks really cute and nice, but we're not continually thinking of saying, always bringing, keeping the top 10 or 15% and culling, assuming we want a herd, say, of 50 cows or whatever, 20 cows, that we're not always changing that because we, sort of they're half pets at the same time, which kind of gets in the way of everything. So I think that to really do this effectively in terms of improving certain things, maybe, and I was thinking fiber you might be able to keep some, but you still can't. We have to get into this idea of why we have these animals, that, and I guess this would be more for the non-hobby herd, is that if we're doing meat, if we're doing fiber or whatever, we really are going to have a changing herd over time, rather than just our initial 20 girls that are all our pets now. Does that make any sense?
It does, and you had a couple of issues I need to address. The first one is saying that you can't select if you sell all your females, and that's not correct, Greg. It's
Okay.
just that when you go, because you've got to get replacements from somewhere, so you're going to be buying replacements in that situation at some point in time, and so it's just making a conscientious effort of when you buy your replacements, to buy from somebody that kept records, that's going to have the top, and he might not let you have his top 5% or 10% or whatever of his herd, but at least you want to keep them on the upper end from who you're buying from as well. And I think it gives you an opportunity, if you're not keeping back any heifers, but you have good production records and on them and all, and your neighbor that's going to be buying your heifers,
Right.
that they're going to be getting a good deal, that you're selling him. You can convince him, look, I'm selling you the top 30% of my heifers, and I'm going to use the other 70% for meat or purposes or whatever else. So you can still absolutely select, even if you're selling all of them that way. And it requires you to do a much better job maybe of on the bull side of things. You're not going to make a lot of rapid genetic change if you're keeping a bull for 10 years and using him and selling all the females. If you could get that bull rotated out sooner, it's going to help your generation interval for one thing. It's going to always be allowing you to make advancements on the bull side of things as well, and also then enable you to make more genetic selection within your herd on the female side as well.
Right. I guess I mean, you made one comment, if you're going to keep your bull for 10 years. A lot of people do. I think part of the problem, I mean, I think with the Angus industry, at least what I watch at Morehead State and so on, is they rotate their cows out at 6 years. They're kind of considered old, and they kind of move them down the road at that point. I mean, for yaks, we're just starting to warm up, at 13 or 14 years old, the cows are still producing just as well. And a lot of people seem to be keeping their bulls for 10 years. So there's this
on the female side, I have no problem with that whatsoever, but
okay.
I do think that
The male side needs
on
to.
the male side of things, I would encourage a more rapid turnover than a 10-year period. And your other point about like I said, I have no problem with the hobby, or you like this old girl or whatever else. Okay, keep her. But but understand, if she's a low producer or whatever else, that you're probably not going to want to keep maybe her daughter at least.
Right.
And so we can still do some things, keep our pets and some things like that, and not completely kill our program.
Yeah. What just to follow up, what kind of period of usage for a bull would you think would be more reasonable?
I would advise baby steps. Now, if we were talking about, you know, I think that 4 years is probably what I would want to work to. But
Okay.
like I say, if we're talking about getting people to go from 10 years to 4 years is probably a really big ask. And so just pulling that back down to, 8 years initially and then trying to, see how it works for you. Uh, just try and, like I say, baby steps sometimes is the best we can do.
Thank you.
You don't need to do much more than 4. I think if you can definitely reasonably use a bull for 4 years, I think.
There, does that change does that change if, for example, the average breeding age is about 3 years of age? Say we're going to breed them to calve at, say, almost 4 years of age. Would that change your length of time you would use a bull?
Not really, Jeff, because I'm still talking about, I'm saying you would use a bull for 4 seasons. So I don't know at what point in time he becomes a breeding age bull, but you use him for 4 seasons and then move to then make a change.
Good.
To be honest, Greg, if and I don't know, you're not saying that 10 is the average, but if it was, I think if you could get to 5 or 6 years, you'd be doing tremendous amount of good.
There, so Shakur sent a question, and I'm gonna let you read through it in the chat.
Okay.
And I don't know for sure that you'll be able to answer it because they've got a very different system where they're breeding to beef animals and oxen, and then back crossing. And so I'm gonna let you take a little time and interpret that.
The interesting part of that for me is his question at the end, which yak breed produces more milk? I guess they have yak breeds over there. We don't have yak breeds here.
That is correct. They do have yak breeds, which are more regionally defined. And so the regions in which those yaks are, they have changed phenotypically. And so again, that has to do with selection pressure and or maybe inbreeding that has been selected for certain animals. So there is differences, and they've qualified those as breeds.
So, here's one of those opportunities that we always try to encourage our students to do, Jeff, is that this is an opportunity I get to say, I have no clue. And so I don't want to blindly answer this. I don't know enough about yak breeding in general and since I don't even know the different breeds, it'd be hard for me to pick out which one. But I don't mind attempting to try and find some literature to see if the answer is out there. I know that when I gave that first talk, Jeff, I did a lot of searching, and there is just not a whole lot out there. There's some out of China, but not a tremendous amount. But unfortunately, I really don't have a clue.
But to help answer that, Shakur, milk production is it would be a highly heritable trait.
It's on the upper end of moderate.
Upper end of moderate.
And so here's the other thing that I'm glad you pointed that out, because I did want to also mention. And so based on that, my guess on the heterosis side of thing is that it's going to be in the moderate side of things too, because typically traits that are moderately heritable also have moderate heterosis, and then it works backwards on the other side. So the highly heritable traits have low heterosis, and the lowly heritable traits have high heterosis. And so the amount of heterosis, the more so in other words, if it's a reproduction trait, we really try and maximize heterosis. And then for traits like milk, which were moderately heritable and moderate heterosis, we put kind of an equal emphasis on that, on those kind of traits.
And so I guess, Shakur, as you look at that, you could begin doing some milk weights, even within a herd. If you were to milk similar aged animals at similar times, that you could get either a weight or a volume collection. With some data, you can find out which individual animals are producing the most, and then begin selection intensity on those animals.
Yeah, I tell you what, if you don't mind, Shakur, if you can you put your email in the chat, and I don't mind looking through this and digesting a little bit more and see if I can get you some information. So if you can put your email in, I'll try and do that.
And I think I have it in mind too, Darrh. I'll make sure and send it to you tomorrow.
Oh, okay.
Shakur, I have some F2s and they definitely have more milk than my 99% yaks.
But Bob, I think that would be just okay, Darrh. So I'm going to show my ignorance here. So if I took a beef animal that has a peak of, I think in our study, we found about 7 kilos, right? About 14, 15 pounds.
Yep.
Yaks probably have a peak of maybe 2 to 3 kilos. So if I took a yak and a cow cross, just simple thinking about the simple cross, the expected milk production would be half of one, half of the other, correct?
Well, in absence of heterosis,
In
but
absence.
since you have heterosis, then you get a bump above the half, or the average of the two. And so since it's a moderately impacted by heterosis, it's not going to bump you up to the point of cattle by any stretch, but it would lift you a little above the average of the two species.
So say we had two kilos in yaks and 7 kilos in beef and 0 heterosis, then our average would be half of 2 is 1, half
4.5.
Right, 4.5. So Bob, it would always be greater, if that makes sense.
Right. My assumption is that Shakur is crossbreeding specifically for milk production.
I think that's right. So Darrh, what about to follow up a little bit on so with outcrossing, if we thought about outcrossing, the tools that we probably have are pedigree and somewhat the 87 SNP markers and using the Matcha-Yak software.
Yep.
That is available.
Yep.
Can you explain or maybe discuss how you would approach to try to maximize outcrossing in both those situations?
Yeah, I really like that Matcha-Yak, software and all. I think that's doing a nice job. Now, for some other things than 87 markers, is that enough? Probably not. But for getting at the heterosis and outcross thing, I think it does a pretty nice job. I think it's a very useful tool. On the pedigree side of things, Jeff, you can certainly do it with pedigree as well. It takes a bit more effort, you know, just digging back. Now, how many generations do you need to go? I think that, you know, going back past, say, great grandparents is putting too much effort into it. And you know, what you're trying to avoid there is just seeing the same name at multiple points and on both sides of the line. That's when you're starting to get into, you know, the more times you're seeing that name, and particularly if it's on both sides of the lines. Now, if it's a lot of times on just one side, on say the sire or the dam you're considering, it's not going to impact you. In other words, when you get the best outcrossing is if you have two very inbred lines that you then cross. And so that's where you get the peak in an outcross. And so don't worry about, you know, that you have a lot of inbreeding on one side or the other. It's that you don't want to see the same animals on both sides of it. And I know that's not definitive at all, but we'd be here a long time tonight if we started getting into too many particulars on that.
No, but I think you hit what I was hoping you would hit, is that, you know, if you were to go back to about that grandsire, grand dam, and make sure you go back on both sire and dam sides to make sure you don't stack too many similar animals in the
Right.
pedigree on both the top and the bottom.
Yep.
Other questions for Dr. Bullock? Going once?
Got a question.
Go ahead.
Back with what you were just saying. What about the recessive gene issue? Is the assumption, I guess. So suppose it was, I don't know, a bull 4 generations ago or whatever, 4 or 5 generations ago, that, you know, had the recessive gene. And so it's sort of percolating through his offspring over the years and gets to the point where, you know, the dam and the sire to be both are carrying it. How do you, I guess you just don't know until it happens, and then you don't know until somebody does, you know, there's enough occurrences to sort of track it down to the
Exactly.
so you really just,
Yeah.
there's no point in trying to stay away from it until it's really been proven it's there.
Well, and that's what makes the match yak so much better, at least on the things that have been identified. And so, so yeah, until you have a specific genomic test, if you're talking about like a lethal or something like that, yeah, it can hide in a population for generations, and then all of a sudden, once you've made the wrong cross that brings it back together, then 25% of your calves are going to be dead. But yeah, it's impossible just to look at the pedigree and know if, you know, the more generation separations you have, I guess, Greg, without seeing any incidences, the safer I think you probably are. But you don't know if people are taking calves and throwing them in a ditch either. So you don't know if those incidences have been happening and people just haven't been reporting it.
Yeah. Okay.
And Darrh, correct me if I'm wrong, but, you know, when some of the issues started popping up on the genetic, on the lethal recessive, from a commercial, what we would call a commercial operation, we didn't put a lot of emphasis on that.
Nope.
And the reason for that was,
well, for us, it's crossbreeding. If you crossbreed, you don't have to worry about it. But yeah, it was much more prevalent on the seed stock side of things.
and with the crossbreeding, it's simply that it allowed us, you know, think about crossbreeding as a greater degree of outcrossing almost, right? I mean,
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And so a particular lethal, they all have lethals, but they're different lethals. And so, so it doesn't, if once you've crossed, then you don't have to worry about it. It's when you've gone back to that, you know, a few generations, Jeff, and you might bring that breed of bull back in, you might still have 8, but it's going to be so minimal at that point, because at that point in time, you're probably only going to have a few females that are potentially carriers of the lethal that would be impacted. So the impact for us in cattle was very minimal for a commercial operation.
So where we may have to be careful on is if I get a bull from Carlise and I use that bull and then Carlise gets heifers or a younger bull calf back from me, then we've just circled those genetics.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. I've got one other dumb question.
Shoot.
Okay, so would it be possible to do a demonstration project and say fiber is something that can be impacted fairly quickly, right? So, through proper selection of animals.
Yeah, I'm assuming. So, I mean, once again, I don't know how heritable the fiber traits are. Typically, like within sheep and all, it's fairly highly heritable.
Okay.
And
Would it, if that's the case, okay, how hard would it be to put together a demonstration project to, or what would be required to do a little project to show the impact of, you know, implementing this this kind of selective breeding, to that you've been talking about for herd improvement or for a fiber breeding objective as a demonstration to people to show that it really works and that it's within reach.
right. There's 2 ways to do it, Greg, and it depends on how much you want to suffer, I guess. You suffer more for speed. And so you can do a divergent selection trial where you basically are using animals that are showing improved quality versus reverse selection, for trying to go the other direction on fiber quality. And so therefore you show the separation pretty quickly, right?
Okay. Yeah.
And as opposed to the other way you do it is you have a baseline here. This is what our quality is now, but then you have to go through several generations to be able to show that, that you have actually improved where you are with quality at that point in time.
Okay.
And so Cat is kind of collecting a lot of data, right, Cat, on some of the fiber traits?
Yeah, right now I've just started doing the baseline as far as like average across the animals as it comes off. And then, yeah, looking to do exactly that and start tracking things like, does that trait follow a bull? Much like it does with, say, a ram, you can very quickly change that fiber by changing out your ram. Views, of course, influence it, but not nearly like a ram does, for whatever reason. We don't know on the yak side of things, like Dr. Bullock was saying earlier, there's not a lot of information. So we're just putting in the data, gathering up the data. I'd love to have a group of animals that we could select specifically and select for that fiber, to see what it does, because we don't know.
So, Kat, what I would recommend, if you're talking about, how many traits are you kind of looking at? Do you think are important for fiber?
I'm starting with fiber diameter because it's an easy trait to start with.
Okay.
And diameter, length, eventually density, any sort of crimp. I mean, we're starting from scratch, whereas the wool industry has 100+ years.
Right. No, I guess the reason I'm asking you, well, once again, to Greg's point, if you're looking at just one trait, you can show change pretty fast, But
Mhm.
the problem is have you negatively impacted something else? Because it can be negatively genetically correlated with another trait.
Right.
So I guess what I'm saying is if there's like 2 or 3 of the most important traits, you might want to think about a selection index, trying to put a selection index together to help in that process.
Okay. Yeah, that would be interesting to see. Like I say, I just started this to satisfy curiosity.
Right.
The other thing to think about is progress. Correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Bullock, but what you showed is thinking about that bell-shaped curve. If there's a wide bell-shaped curve, progress will maybe be faster than if that bell-shaped curve is really narrow.
Sure. So the
So,
more genetic variation you have in a herd, the better off you are. But that kind of relates to heritability as well.
mhm. Yeah, and see, we're not sure because not having data, we're not sure what exactly is heritable
Right.
or not. I mean, we have some assumptions,
Right.
but no
I'm
actual
gonna bet
data
that they are at least moderately heritable to highly heritable, most of your fiber traits.
I would assume so. They are in other species.
Right. Yeah. Yep.
Just getting the data points.
So that brings up another good point. Kat's been taking in samples and measuring, Dr. Bullock. And so, and Kat, you may know the answer to this already, but is there a given age or a given, we want them all to kind of be uniform, right? When we take that sample to measure it.
Ideally, but that's why I've been running over what 3, almost 4 years now, knowing that to start with, we're probably not getting that. And so it has been interesting. I've been trying to get producers to repeat animals that they can. So I've got a couple of batches of animals that I've seen for 3 and 4 years now, and they do change. Now, what the variable is on that change, I don't know, whether it's environmental, age, nutritionally, I don't know. And those are certainly questions I want answers to. Because I know all of that plays into our other fiber. You get a ewe with a fever, you're almost guaranteed to have a break in the wool. So there's lots of different traits that you're going to see. It seems like 18 months is kind of the magic number for when they change from baby fiber to adult fiber and they settle into a type, but the variation isn't very big, a couple of microns.
Yeah, so maybe it's not as big of an issue. Maybe you have a bigger age window to be able to pull those samples in from.
I think so. Like I say, it doesn't seem to vary drastically once they hit that adult hair point. Now, baby hair, under 18 months, 2 years of age, and over that, definitely a difference. Sometimes you can't even hardly get a sample of that baby hair without cutting it. So they just don't want to let it go.
So I think then that, it's the data collection, that sounds like, is pretty important. And it sounds like you got an idea of that 18, 24 month may be a good target age to be thinking about. And Darrh, then to do that divergent selection, you got to kind of know the two tail ends there, right?
Absolutely.
And so, and then it becomes trying to breed an average population to those two different bulls. So it means you've got to have either AI or you've got to have a big enough herd to be able to throw 20 animals in with this bull and 20 animals in with that bull and see what the average of the progeny are going to be.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so you don't, if you're trying to do a demonstration, Greg, that's the other thing I'll advise is you never want to do it with minimal numbers because because we always have error involved. And so you don't want to leave yourself open for the results not to come out like, that they should, but based on heritability and things like that. But, if you just selected one bull that had poor hair fiber and another bull that had great hair fiber and just bred each of them to 20 animals in 1 year under one setting and expect to show a big difference, you might get yourself in trouble because that could have been that one situation. The bull with the bad fiber might just have been some, like Kat was saying, some sort of environmental thing that caused that. And so then you're in trouble.
I think it would be more practical from a breeder standpoint to be doing that baseline
Yeah,
over multiple
absolutely.
generations.
Yep. Yeah, no question
Takes
about
longer.
it. From a practical standpoint, I was just talking about from a strictly demonstration standpoint. The divergent selection is a very powerful tool
Yeah.
because there you have the two that you can show them to. With the baseline, you have to kind of say, here's the data, trust me. They were bad here and they're good now.
Yeah, you can't go see.
Yep, yep, yep.
Makes sense.
Any other questions for Dr. Bullock? All right. Well, I hope that you enjoyed tonight's presentation. Dr. Bullock, thank you for sharing again. I think it's always good to review that selection discussion and thinking about how we can potentially begin using and implementing that. And I think that, the tools we have may be limited right now, but it doesn't mean that there isn't a need to continue to start thinking about collecting data. And some of that data is as simple as, using other resources we have, like sending in fiber to CAT to get data back and keeping that data. And then the calving books that we sent around for, calving intervals to see if we're having inbreeding depression, where instead of having a calf every 365 days, they're pushing out to 400 days. Sometimes that's environmental, sometimes it's inbreeding depression. But as we begin to collect more information, we can kind of see what those bell-shaped curves begin to look like. And a lot of this you can do within your own herd. And so you begin looking within your own herd. So with that, our next session is going to be May the 17th. Dr. Anderson is going to join us, and he's going to talk about some of the technologies and tools that we have to control when calves might be born. And so this is going to take a spin off of some of our AI work that we've been doing, and it'll also be interweaving some of the differences that maybe we've seen and or similarities we've seen on the beef cattle side as it relates to yaks. So with that, thanks everybody for joining, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Some of you, it's pretty late. Some of you, Kat, it's still kind of early.
Yeah. It's still almost daylight.
Thanks everybody for joining us again, and I'll send out a link to the video in the next couple of days if you know folks that couldn't get on and you want to forward it to them, and then we'll send it out through the membership list as well. Thanks everybody.
Take care, everybody.
Good
Bye-bye.
night.
There. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank
Thanks,
you
Jeff.
guys.